Dear participants, so far we spoke about the institutional setup and the framework for PPP. We discussed what is PPP. Then we gave you the type of PPP. We spoke about what are the conditions for PPP, the prerequisite, the benefit, the pitfalls. Then in Module 2, we discussed the legal framework and the regulatory framework, what kind of legislation, why this is needed, what form of legislation, is it regulation by contract? We discussed also if you want to go through general legislation or specific sectorial legislation. Now we're gonna zoom into the specific of the type of public-private partnership. And that's where the details of what kind of models should be used could be used. So what we will discuss first, it depends of your objective. How much private sector involvement you would like to see. If you recall at the beginning, in some definition of PPP, people will say service contract are not form of PPP. In fact, it's true. Service contract is in reality a kind, I give the private sector a contract to operate a fraction of something in a water treatment plant, in a power plant, in a transport project, where the private will not raise any money, will not take any risk, and they will be paid on delivering the service. So if you look in front of you this chart, depending how much investment you would like to raise from the private sector, you will get more private sector and what kind of allocation of risk and obligation. So the spectrum is to go from service contract, basically where no risk from the private sector, no money coming from the private sector, is delivery of service, to another layer, and usually a service contract takes 2 to 3 years. So another layer is called management contract, where you ask the private sector to come for 8 years, to operate, maintain, and you public sector, you ask the private sector to invest your money. In other words, the private sector become investing of the public money. And that's what we call performance-based management contract. The lease contract is a bit the same, but a longer period of time. Then by the time you get to a concession, here where you ask the private sector to come, bring their own money, take a concession for around 20 to 25 years, operate your system, and run it, and invest. That's what we have seen in the case of the water sector in Morocco, where most of the water have been under concession right now for the last 20 years, I would say, in every single city, wherever Rabat, Casablanca, all of them are under water concession with the private sector. This is for existing project. Then you might have what we call green project, greenfield project, new project, where you ask the sector, private sector to come, to bring their money, to build, operate for 25 years, and after that, to transfer. Then you have another variant, we'll talk about it, called DBFO. This is basically the spectrum on which you operate. The base of difference is about the responsibility, ownership of the asset, duration of the contract, the risk assessment, the level of regulation, and how much responsibility you can give to whom. But there is, as we said earlier, there is a need for regulation to protect the consumer from the and to monitor performance of the service. So that any form of this kind of public-private partnership, it's very important to have the regulatory framework in place. In some places, we will call for independent regulator because regulation by contract is not sufficient. The regulator, usually created by legislation, with commission independent, usually they are appointed by the parliament, its responsibility is to set the tariff, registration of the company, monitor operating, setting entry, create a level playing field, setting up the quality standard, setting the environmental, and putting health and safety regulation. In our countries, Canada, we have regulator at the provincial level as well as at the federal level, and they are independent. And that's very important. Any project, for instance, in province of Quebec, of Hydro-Quebec, when they do their investment plan, they go to the regulator, they present it there, and from there they go to the parliament for discussion before it's approved by the minister. So the regulatory is a very important aspect to ensure transparency, integrity, and independence. We're gonna go again model by model. The service contract is a private partner. It supply material service. The contract is typically 2 to 5 years. Example, food catering to passenger board, Indian Railway. And it could be, and I'm pretty sure in your country you have already some of those service contracts. This is normal way, frankly, and it's like subcontracting one activities when you cannot do it at the public sector. The management operation is an umbrella term ranging from technical assistance to operation and maintenance contract. The private sector partner is paid on a fixed fees. I will pay you, public sector. Private sector, I will pay the private sector fixed fees. And I can give you also probably a performance-based incentive so you can work hard. The example, new container terminal in Bangladesh is completely management contract. I have other example of management contract in the water sector in sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen a lot of this. The problem with those contracts, they are short-term. The private sector does not take a lot of risk because frankly, they don't invest any on their own money and they are paid on fixed fees, plus on their performance, they can get a bonus. I would recommend it if you have no other choice than going. Lease and affirmation contract. These are interesting contracts where the private operator is responsible for operating and maintaining the utility, but not for financing the investment. Financing the investment is coming from the public sector, but implemented by the private sector. And an example of this kind of lease affirmation contract are all the water sector, drinking water sector in France. Each municipality in France gave an affirmation contract, a lease contract to the private sector to operate their systems. And it's working very well actually for the last 50 years. Those contracts could go between 8 and 15 years. And we've seen this model exported to Senegal, where it has been operating for the last 10 years, and I know it personally, Cameroon, Gabon, and many other African countries use the affirmation contract based on the French model, which worked very well and very efficient, especially in water utility sectors. The concession contract is getting more complicated because the private partner has the right to use assets that are put at their disposal. These are public assets. The public authority partner maintain asset ownership. I remain the owner of the asset. And typically the authority is responsible for replacing larger assets, but the private sector is responsible of also investment. And we've seen a lot of those concession period contracts that go between 25 to 30 years, like the Don Hong Tollway in Thailand. We've seen the Senegal toll road. We've seen in Argentina a few projects. We've seen in project in Brazil. Of course, we've seen in the United States, a lot of those concessions, in Europe, in Germany. Those are long-term contracts. And this is where you talk about 25 years, where the public sector and the private sector assume responsibility, where the private sector is responsible for investment, the public sector remain owner of the asset, but basically the risks are shared between the public and the private sector. Then within the concession, because concessions are usually given for existing projects, existing assets. But if I want to develop a new project, a new power plant, a new water supply project, a new hydropower plant, a new highway, now this is what we call greenfield project, new project. I can go through what I call build, own, operate, BOT, build, operate, own also. I can go through lease, development, operate. All I go is wraparound or addition, WAAA for some project. So there are a lot of nuances and all depend of what you want to do when you decide to expand an asset, create a new project, or merge other projects. And these models are all applicable, but they are all under the family of concession or the family of the BOT. Usually we always hold BOT, We rarely hear about LDO, build, own, operate, or build, operate, transfer, or build, own, operate, boot, etc., etc., etc. So these BOT are grant the right to the private sector to finance, construct, and develop and operate the facility. After a project period, the facility transferred to the public partner, again 25 years, and the Bangkok mass transit system is a good example. In the United States, we have also a lot of examples like that. We already gave you an example of this. We talked about the boot, the different BLOT, and the BTO. I will not go in a lot of detail, but each of this has its own specificity. It depends also on the objective, what you want to do. But the principle operate under the same framework, which are public partner grant the right to the private partner to finance, construct, develop an assets. Talk about 25 years. Capital is raised by the private sector, implemented by private sector, and after X number of years, this project is either returned to the public sector or extended, or maybe the private sector keep it and buy the asset from the public sector. You have also the design, build, operate project. The private sector award the contract to design, construct, finance, and operate the project. The private partner may be either paid by the public partner or collect fee from the project end user. And that's an interesting part of looking at the risk sharing. So you have to assume that the affordability was studied and looked at very interesting way when you design the project. Because if the end user cannot afford to pay, this project will fail. And therefore, the economist working on this project will need to have very strong affordability studies. The public partner remain ownership of the project. An example is the London Underground system. Then we have the type of DBFO contract. And these are the design, build, finance, operate. We can talk about build, develop, operate. We can talk about build, own, operate. We can talk about design, construct, manage, finance. So this project, all of them, could be looked at from a holistic point of view. It could be too complicated. But in my opinion, you have to look at it the very simple way. I go back to that slide. What do you want to achieve? How much ownership are you ready to give to the private sector? What kind of investment you want to put and how much you are ready as public sector to invest or not? And therefore, what you want from the private sector? What kind of risk allocation? And the spectrum here along that list will allow you to decide what you want to do. In my experience, if you don't know where to start, you can start by giving a lease contract. I prefer project where the private sector takes some risk on investment as well. The other forms are normal, and we've seen it everywhere. So for any new project that you would like to develop, airport, highway, power, in my opinion, you have to think right away in the context of the BOT, or for the existing asset that you have to look at the concession. So if we start with these three models, lease, concession, BOT, and you can build around it in your country, I think it's a good starting point. And when you're gonna think about this project and what is applicable to your country, think about how much private sector investment you want, how much allocation of risk, and what's the duration of the contract you would like to do. We have a list of very useful links available to you here from the World Bank, from the IFC, from the Asian Development Bank, from different organizations, from the European Commission, different resource book on PPP, case study that give you a good example of what to do and what not to do. Thank you.